What if one desperate father's search for answers led him to discover that his daughter, declared dead in a tragic accident 2 years ago, was not only alive, but living with 8 other young people in an abandoned warehouse? Byron Evans never expected to find hope in a crumbling building on the outskirts of Millbrook Valley. 9-year-old Juniper Shaw never imagined her secret would change everything, but that fog-covered morning in November, when a single dad, a missing daughter, and 8 forgotten souls crossed paths, nothing would ever be the same again. And when the military finally revealed what they'd been hiding about that night 2 years ago, the internet exploded with a story so unbelievable, so heartbreaking, and so ultimately triumphant that it restored faith in the power of a parent's love and the resilience of the human spirit. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fog rolled through Millbrook Valley like a gray blanket, muffling the sounds of the early morning and turning familiar streets into ghostly corridors. Byron Evans pulled his jacket tighter as he stepped out of his battered pickup truck, the metal door groaning in protest. For 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days, he had been searching. For 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days, he had refused to believe what everyone else had accepted as truth. His daughter was not dead. The abandoned warehouse district on the edge of town wasn't the kind of place most people ventured, especially not at dawn on a Tuesday morning. But Byron had followed every lead, chased every rumor, investigated every whisper that suggested something wasn't right about that night 2 years ago. The night when 9-year-old Juniper Shaw had supposedly died in a bus accident that claimed 12 young lives, except there had been inconsistencies, missing records, witness statements that didn't align, and a father's intuition that screamed louder than any official report. The warehouse loomed before him, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring into the mist. Building 47 on Industrial Row, a place that should have been empty, condemned, forgotten. But smoke was rising from a makeshift chimney someone had fashioned from old metal pipes. And there were sounds coming from inside. Young voices. Laughter that carried on the cold morning air like something from a dream. Byron's heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the side entrance, a door that hung slightly ajar despite the November chill. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle. 2 years of searching, of being told he was delusional, of being pitied by neighbors who thought grief had driven him mad. It all led to this moment. He pushed the door open slowly, wincing as the hinges creaked. What he saw inside stopped him cold. The warehouse had been transformed into something extraordinary. Tarps and blankets created makeshift rooms. Garden plots fashioned from old pallets lined the walls, somehow thriving despite the season. A central area had been cleared and furnished with salvaged furniture, mismatched chairs, a table made from wooden crates, shelves built from scrap wood and filled with books that looked like they'd been rescued from library donations. And there, stirring something in a pot over a small camp stove, was a girl with long brown hair tied back in a ponytail. Byron's knees nearly buckled. The hair was longer now, and she was taller. Of course she was 2 years older, but he would know that profile anywhere. The way she concentrated when she worked, tongue poking slightly between her lips. The careful, methodical way she moved her hands. Juniper? The name escaped his lips as barely a whisper. The girl turned, and Byron felt the world tilt on its axis. It was her. It was absolutely, undeniably her. The same green eyes that matched his own, the same small scar above her left eyebrow from when she'd fallen off her bike at age 6. But there was something different too, a maturity, a caution that hadn't been there before. She stared at him for a long moment, her face cycling through emotions he couldn't read. Recognition, fear, hope, something that might have been relief. Daddy? Her voice was older now, but it was hers. Before he could respond, 8 other figures emerged from various corners of the warehouse. Young people ranging in age from what looked like 7 to maybe 15, all watching him with expressions that ranged from curious to protective. They formed a loose circle around Juniper, not threatening exactly, but clearly prepared to shield her if needed. "It's okay," Juniper said quietly to the group, never taking her eyes off Byron. This is my dad." A boy who couldn't have been more than 8 stepped forward, chin raised defiantly despite the tremor in his voice. "You're not supposed to be here. Nobody's supposed to know about this place." Byron barely heard him. He was moving forward, drawn by a magnetic force he couldn't resist. Juniper took a tentative step toward him, then another, and then they were running toward each other across the concrete floor. When she crashed into his arms, Byron felt something inside him that had been broken for 2 years finally click back into place. She was solid, real, alive. Her hair smelled like wood smoke and whatever she'd been cooking, and she was so much taller than he remembered. But she was here. She was here. "I knew you'd find me," she whispered against his shoulder. "I never stopped believing you'd find me." Byron held her tighter, tears streaming down his face as he buried his nose in her hair. "I never stopped looking. Not for one single day." When they finally separated, the other 8 had moved closer. Byron could see them more clearly now, a mix of boys and girls, all clearly living rough but somehow not beaten down by it. They looked at Juniper with affection, and at him with cautious evaluation. "Where have you been?" Byron asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "The bus accident," they said. "There was no bus accident," interrupted a girl who looked to be about 13, with short black hair and intelligent dark eyes. At least, not the way they told it. An older boy, maybe 15, with prematurely serious eyes, added, "There are things you need to know. Things they've been hiding." Byron looked around at the group, then back at his daughter. "Juniper, sweetheart, what happened that night? Where have you been all this time?" Juniper glanced at the others, some silent communication passing between them. Then she looked back at her father, her small hand finding his. "We've been hiding, Daddy, all of us. Because if they found us, if they knew we were alive, double quotes." She paused, swallowing hard. "They said terrible things would happen. They said we could never go home." The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of wind rattling the broken windows. Byron felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November morning. Whatever had happened 2 years ago, whatever had separated him from his daughter, it was bigger than a simple accident. Much bigger. And as he looked around at 8 other young faces, all of them supposedly dead, all of them very much alive, he began to understand that finding Juniper was just the beginning. The real story, the truth that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to hide, was still waiting to be uncovered. But for now, none of that mattered. His daughter was alive. She was in his arms. And he was never, ever letting her go again. The silence in the warehouse stretched until it felt fragile, like something that might shatter if anyone spoke too loudly. Byron remained kneeling beside his daughter, one hand still touching her shoulder as if to convince himself she was real. But his eyes were taking in details, now details that made his stomach twist with a mixture of relief and growing dread. The 9 young people living in this abandoned place weren't just surviving. They were thriving in a way that spoke of careful planning and remarkable resourcefulness. But they were also clearly hiding from something far more dangerous than the elements. "Daddy," Juniper said softly, breaking the silence. "I need to tell you something. We all do, but first ... She looked around at the others, seeking some kind of permission. "First, you need to promise that you won't tell anyone you found us." "Not yet." Byron's protective instincts flared immediately. "Juniper, sweetheart, you're coming home with me right now. I don't know what's been happening here, but no." The word came from the 13-year-old girl with the sharp eyes and short black hair. She stepped forward, her posture defensive but not aggressive. "You don't understand. None of us can go home. Not until it's safe." "I'm sorry," Byron said, standing slowly and fixing the girl with a steady look. "I don't believe we've been introduced." The girl lifted her chin. "Kathleen Chavez. And before you ask, yes, I'm supposed to be dead too. Car accident, March 15th, 2 years ago. Except I wasn't in any car that night." Another voice spoke up from across the circle, a boy who looked about 12, with sandy hair and freckles that reminded Byron of his own childhood. "Georgia Schmidt. Train derailment, June 3rd. Only there was no train." One by one, they introduced themselves. Cyril Beckett, age 10, allegedly drowned in Millfield Lake. Ceres Hayes, 14, house fire on Maple Street that supposedly left no survivors. Dahlia Vance, 11, hiking accident in Thornwood State Park. Ira Croft, 7, the youngest who supposedly died in a playground accident at Roosevelt Elementary. Each name, each supposed death, hit Byron like a physical blow. These weren't just random kids who had ended up together. They were all supposedly casualties of various accidents across the Tri-County area over the past 3 years. All declared dead, all grieved by families who had been told their bodies were too damaged to recover, or lost in circumstances that made remains impossible to find. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And all very much alive. "I don't understand," Byron said, his voice barely steady. "Why would anyone? How could so many deaths be faked? And why?" The oldest of the group, the 15-year-old boy with serious eyes, stepped forward. "My name is Alden Thorne. I've been here the longest 3 years in December. And I can tell you exactly why they did this to us, but you're not going to like the answer." Juniper moved closer to her father, slipping her small hand into his larger one. "Daddy, do you remember the night I supposedly died? Do you remember what I was doing that day?" Byron's mind raced back to that horrible evening. The phone call that had changed everything. The rush to the hospital, only to be told that the bus accident had been so severe, so catastrophic, that positive identification wasn't possible. The closed casket funeral, the sleepless nights that followed. "You were at the science fair," he said slowly. "The regional competition at Westfield High School. You'd won first place for the county with your project on water purification." Juniper nodded, her eyes bright with something that might have been pride mixed with fear. "Do you remember what my project was really about, though? Not just water purification. I'd figured out how to detect specific chemical compounds in groundwater. Compounds that weren't supposed to be there." A chill ran down Byron's spine. "Chemical compounds?" Kathleen stepped forward again. "We all found something, Mr. Evans. All of us. Each of our projects, our investigations, our discoveries, they all pointed to the same thing. Something that certain people didn't want discovered." "What kind of something?" Byron asked, though part of him was already afraid of the answer. Alden pulled out a weathered folder from behind one of the makeshift shelves. Ceres was working on a geology project about soil contamination around Blackstone River. Dahlia was studying unusual fish die-offs in the county lakes for her biology class. Cyril had noticed pattern anomalies in local weather data that suggested atmospheric contamination. "I was researching cancer clusters in the 3-county area for a health science project," Georgia added quietly. "Mapping incidents against geographical features and industrial sites." Byron felt the ground shifting beneath him. "You're telling me that you were all what? Investigating some kind of environmental cover-up?" "Not investigating," Juniper said softly. "We just stumbled onto it. We were kids doing school projects, asking questions that probably seemed harmless to us. But apparently, we asked the right questions, or the wrong ones, Caitlin muttered darkly. The night of my accident, Alden continued, I had just submitted my science fair project about groundwater contamination patterns to my teacher. The next morning, I woke up in a van with two men in military uniforms telling me that I was dead, that my family thought I was dead, and that I could never go home again unless I wanted my family to join me. The warehouse fell silent again. Byron could hear his own heartbeat, could feel Juniper's small hand trembling in his military uniforms. The pieces were starting to form a picture he didn't want to see. They told us, Juniper said, her voice barely above a whisper, that there was a classified project. Something involving chemical testing that had been going on for years across multiple sites in the region. They said our research, even though we were just kids, had gotten too close to sensitive information. Information that could compromise national security, Dahlia added, her young voice carrying a bitter edge. That's what they called it. Byron's mind was reeling. So they faked your deaths, all of you, to silence you, to protect the project. Ceres corrected. They said if we ever tried to go home, if we ever talked about what we'd discovered, they would make sure our families had accidents too, real ones. The implications hit Byron like a sledgehammer. 9 young people, all bright, all curious, all asking inconvenient questions about environmental damage that someone with serious power wanted to keep secret. So they had been erased, declared dead, hidden away to silence them, but they hadn't been silenced. They had found each other. They had survived, and now finally they had been found. How long do they expect you to stay hidden? Byron asked. Alden shrugged. Forever, as far as we know. Until the project is complete, or until we're old enough that no one would believe. US, even if we did talk. Juniper looked up at her father, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. Daddy, we've been so scared. But we've also been planning. We've been gathering evidence, documenting everything we can remember, because someday we knew someone would come looking. We knew someone would believe us. And we hoped, Caitlin added, that when that someone came, they would be brave enough to help us fight back. The weight of their expectations, their hope, their desperation, settled on Byron's shoulders like a heavy cloak. These weren't just 9 young people who needed rescue. They were 9 pieces of evidence in what sounded like a massive conspiracy. 9 witnesses to something that powerful people had literally killed them to keep quiet. And now they were asking him, a single father who fixed cars for a living, to take on forces that had the resources to fake multiple deaths and the authority to threaten families with military precision. Byron looked around at the 9 young faces, all watching him, with expressions that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. His daughter was alive. That was a miracle beyond anything he had dared to hope for. But she was also in danger. They all were, and getting them to safety would require more than just a father's love. It would require courage, careful planning, and probably more luck than any one person deserved. But as he looked at Juniper's face, at the trust and hope shining in her eyes, Byron knew there was really only one choice to make. Tell me everything, he said quietly. Every detail, every piece of evidence, every threat they made. Tell me everything, and then we're going to figure out how to bring you all home. The story came out in fragments over the next hour, pieced together like a puzzle made of nightmares. Byron sat cross-legged on the concrete floor of the warehouse, surrounded by 9 young people who spoke in hushed tones about things no one their age should ever have to understand. Juniper remained close to his side, sometimes filling in details, other times simply holding his hand as if anchoring herself to the reality that he was finally there. The first thing you have to understand, Alden said, spreading out a collection of hand-drawn maps across the makeshift table, is that none of us were taken at the same time. This was planned over months, maybe years. Caitlin nodded, her finger tracing routes on one of the maps. I was first 3 years ago. They kept me isolated for weeks, telling me my family had been told I was dead, that there was no going back. Then they brought Ceres, then Georgia. She paused, glancing at the younger ones. By the time they brought Ira, we realized they were building a collection. A collection of what? Byron asked, though his stomach was already churning with the implications. Inconvenient witnesses, Dahlia said matter-of-factly, her 11-year-old voice carrying a weight that made Byron's heart ache. Kids who asked the wrong questions about the right things. Ira, the youngest at 7, climbed into George's lap and spoke for the first time since the introductions. They kept us in a big building at first, like a school, but with bars on the windows. They said we were being protected. Protected from what? Byron asked gently. From people who would hurt our families if they knew we were alive, Cyril answered. That's what they told us anyway. And at first, some of us believed them. Alden pulled out another folder, this one, filled with newspaper clippings, printed articles, and what looked like official documents. But we started to piece things together. The accidents that supposedly killed us, they all happened within a 50-mile radius of 3 specific locations. He spread the clippings across the table. Byron leaned forward, reading headlines that made his blood run cold. Tragic bus accident claims 12 young lives. Rising high school star dies in car crash. Local elementary student drowns in freak accident. The locations, Juniper said softly, pointing to marks on the map, are here, here, and here. Blackstone Chemical Processing Plant, Meridian Agricultural Research Facility, and Thornwood Environmental Testing Compound. Byron studied the map, his mechanic's eye for patterns helping him see what the kids had discovered. These sites form a triangle, and all your supposed accidents happened within this area. Not just within the area, Caitlin corrected. The accidents happened to kids whose school projects or research somehow touched on environmental issues related to these facilities. Groundwater near Blackstone, soil contamination around Meridian, air quality changes around Thornwood. We think, Georgia added quietly, that there's been some kind of long-term testing program, chemical or biological. And when kids started accidentally documenting effects, she trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Byron felt a rage building in his chest that was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. So they decided it was easier to make you disappear than to stop whatever they were doing. The man who came to see us, Ira said from Georgia's lap. The one in the fancy uniform with lots of medals, he said we were heroes. He said we were helping protect America. Helping protect America by staying dead, Ceres said bitterly. Warehouse fell quiet except for the sound of wind rattling the loose metal sheets on the roof. Biren looked around at these remarkable young people who had somehow managed to survive, to stay together, to keep hope alive in circumstances that would have broken most adults. How did you end up here? He asked. How did you escape from wherever they were keeping you? The kids exchanged glances, and Byron saw something pass between them, a shared memory that clearly carried weight. Alden, Juniper said simply. Tell him about the fire. Alden's expression grew somber. 8 months ago, there was an electrical fire in the building where they were keeping us. Not a big one, but enough to trigger the evacuation protocols. In the confusion, Caitlin and I realized that some of the guards were more concerned about their own safety than watching us. We grabbed the little ones, Caitlin continued, and we ran. We'd been planning for months, memorizing guard rotations, mapping the facility. When the opportunity came, we took it. But we didn't know where to go, Georgia added. We couldn't go home. They'd made it clear what would happen to our families if we did. So we found this place. Dahlia gestured around the warehouse. It was abandoned, but it had good bones. We've been fixing it up ever since, making it livable, learning how to take care of ourselves. Byron looked around with new eyes, seeing not just the makeshift nature of their accommodations, but the ingenuity and care that had gone into creating this space. Solar panels jury-rigged to car batteries for power. A water collection and filtration system that would have impressed any engineer. Gardens that somehow thrive despite the concrete and the season. You built all this yourselves? We had to, Cyril said with quiet pride. No one else was going to do it for us. The simple statement hit Byron harder than all the horror stories combined. These kids, and they were still kids, despite everything they'd been through, had been forced to become completely self-sufficient. They'd created not just a shelter, but a home. Not just survival, but a life. We've been documenting everything, Juniper said, pulling out another folder. Every detail we could remember about the facilities, the people who took us, the projects they mentioned. We knew that someday, someone would believe us. Someone would help us tell the truth. She looked up at her father with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone her age. We hoped it would be you, Daddy, but we also knew it might not be. We knew we might have to wait until we were old enough to fight this ourselves. Byron reached out and gently touched his daughter's cheek. You shouldn't have had to wait. You shouldn't have had to do any of this alone. We weren't alone, Ira piped up from George's lap. We had each other. We're family now, Dahlia added simply. Not the family we were born with, but the family we chose. The words hit Byron like a physical blow. These 9 young people had been torn from their biological families, declared dead to the world, and forced to create their own support system from scratch. And they'd done it. They'd built something remarkable from the ashes of their stolen childhoods. Slowly, deliberately, Byron stood up. He walked over to the small camp stove where Juniper had been cooking when he first found them. The pot was still warm, filled with what looked like a simple but nutritious stew made from canned goods and dried vegetables. Have you eaten today? He asked, looking around the group. We were just starting lunch when you arrived, Caitlin said cautiously. Byron nodded and began ladling the stew into mismatched bowls. It was such a small gesture, but as he handed each bowl to each child, he saw something shift in their expressions. The wariness didn't disappear entirely, but it softened. Here was an adult who wasn't asking them to explain themselves or prove their worth. He was simply feeding them. When everyone had a bowl, Byron served himself and sat back down in their circle. For several minutes, they ate in comfortable silence, the warmth of the food and the simple act of sharing, a meal creating a bubble of normalcy in their extraordinary situation. Finally, Juniper looked up at her father. What happens now, Daddy? Byron set down his bowl and looked around at 9 faces that were watching him with a mixture of hope and fear. They'd been brave for so long, been strong for so long, been independent for so long. But underneath it all, they were still kids who wanted adults they could trust to help carry the weight of their impossible situation. Now, he said quietly, we figure out how to get you all home safely. And how to make sure the people who did this to you can never do it to anyone else. It was a promise that felt both enormous and utterly necessary. Looking at these remarkable young survivors, Byron knew he would move mountains to keep it. Over the next 3 days, Byron found himself living a double life that felt surreal in its contradictions. By day, he went through the motions of his normal routine, opening Evan's automotive repair, fixing transmissions and brake systems, nodding politely when neighbors asked how he was holding up after all these years. But every evening, as soon as he closed the shop, he drove to the warehouse district with supplies hidden in toolboxes and spare tire wells. He was learning that the 9 young people hadn't just survived their captivity and escape. They had built something remarkable. Each of them had taken on roles that played to their strengths and covered the group's needs with an efficiency that would have impressed any organizational consultant. Alden, the oldest, served as their informal leader and security coordinator. He'd created a system of watches and signals that ensured they always knew who was approaching the warehouse long before anyone could get close enough to surprise them. His maps of the surrounding area were detailed enough to rival anything professional surveyor might produce. Caitlin had become their researcher and archivist. Every piece of information they'd gathered about their captors, Every detail they could remember about the facilities where they'd been held. Every newspaper clipping about their supposed deaths. She had it all organized in a filing system that would have made a librarian proud. Georgia had taken charge of their food systems. From growing vegetables in the improvised garden plots, to managing their supplies and planning meals that stretched their limited resources while keeping everyone healthy. She'd learned to can and preserve food by trial and error, creating a pantry that could sustain them through winter. The younger ones each had their specialties too. Cyril had become their electronics expert, somehow managing to keep their jury-rigged power systems running, and even establishing a limited internet connection through a complex arrangement involving a neighbor's unprotected Wi-Fi network and some ingenious signal boosting. Dahlia managed their medical supplies and basic first aid, having taught herself from library books about treating common injuries and illnesses. Sari served as their lookout and early warning system, having developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when something wasn't right in their environment. Ira, despite being the youngest, had become their morale officer, somehow maintaining an optimism that kept the group's spirits up during their darkest moments. And Juniper Barron's brilliant, resourceful daughter had become their memory keeper. She documented every detail of their individual stories, cross-referencing information to build a comprehensive picture of what had been done to them and why. "You've built something incredible here," Byron told them on his third evening visit, as he helped Cyril troubleshoot a problem with their water filtration system. "I mean it. Most adults couldn't have managed what you've accomplished." "We didn't have a choice," Caitlin said, but there was pride in her voice rather than bitterness. "There's always a choice," Byron replied gently. "You chose to survive together, instead of giving up separately. You chose to take care of each other instead of looking out only for yourselves. Those were good choices." He was learning their individual stories too, not just the horrible circumstances that had brought them together, but who they had been before, who they were becoming now. Alden had been a Boy Scout, which explained his organizational skills and outdoor knowledge. Caitlin had been in advanced placement classes in student government, natural preparation for her role as their strategic thinker. Georgia had grown up on a small farm before moving to town, which was why she understood plants and food preservation instinctively. Cyril's father had been an electrician, and he'd absorbed knowledge by watching and helping from a young age. Dahlia's mother was a nurse, and she'd picked up medical basics through dinner-table conversations and Take Your Daughter to Work days. But it was the smaller details that really got to be ran the way. Sari still slept with a stuffed rabbit she'd managed to grab during their escape. How Ira insisted on saying grace before meals, a tradition from her family that she'd kept alive for the group. The fact that Juniper still wore the friendship bracelet she'd been making for her best friend the day she'd supposedly died. They were adapting to his presence too, slowly allowing him into their carefully constructed routines. On the second evening, Georgia had asked his opinion about whether it was safe to plant winter vegetables. On the third, Alden had shown him their security protocols and asked if he thought they'd missed anything important. Most significantly, they'd begun to trust him with their fears. "I dream about my mom sometimes," Dahlia confided on Thursday evening as they worked together to repair a section of roof that had been damaged in a recent storm. "I wonder if she still thinks about me, or if it's easier for her to believe I'm really gone." "She thinks about you," Byron said with quiet certainty. "Every single day. Parents don't stop loving their children just because they're told they're dead. She's probably doing exactly what I did, refusing to believe it, looking for proof that you're still out there somewhere." Dahlia was quiet for a moment. "Do you think we'll ever be able to go home?" It was the question that haunted all of them, the one they rarely voiced but that Byron could see in their eyes whenever they looked at him. They'd built a life in this warehouse, created a family, developed systems that worked. But it was still a life in hiding, still a childhood stolen, Still a situation that couldn't last forever. I think, Byron said carefully, that we're going to find a way to make it safe for you to go home. It might take time and it might be complicated, but yes, I believe you'll all go home eventually. What if our families don't want us back? Ira asked from across the workspace, her small voice carrying a weight that made Byron's chest tight. What if they've gotten used to us being gone? Byron stopped what he was doing and looked directly at her. Ira, sweetheart, can I tell you something? Every single day for 2 years, I woke up and the first thing I thought was Juniper should be here. Every meal I ate, I thought this would taste better if I was sharing it with my daughter. Every joke I heard, every sunset I saw, every small good thing that happened, it all felt incomplete because she wasn't there to share it with me. He gestured around the warehouse. Your families aren't just missing you, they're incomplete without you. They've been walking around with holes in their hearts, shaped exactly like each of you. The work continued in thoughtful silence after that, but Byron noticed something had shifted. The kids were moving with less tension in their shoulders, talking more freely, making eye contact more readily. They were beginning to believe that their situation might actually change. That evening, as they shared another simple but nourishing meal around their makeshift table, Juniper asked the question Byron had been dreading. Daddy, what's our plan? I know you're gathering information and trying to understand everything, but what's our actual plan for fighting back? Byron looked around the table at 9 expectant faces. They'd been patient with him for 3 days, allowing him to process the magnitude of what they were facing, letting him see the remarkable life they'd built for themselves. But they were right to ask. They'd been in survival mode for too long. They deserved action. I think, he said slowly, that our first step has to be getting you all somewhere safer than this. Somewhere with better protection and more resources. I know a place my Uncle Finch has a ranch about 2 hours north of here. It's remote, defensible, and he's the kind of man who asks questions later and shoots first if anyone threatens family. You want us to leave here? Caitlin asked, and Byron could hear the reluctance in her voice. This warehouse wasn't just their shelter, it was their fortress, their creation, their proof that they could take care of themselves. I want us to upgrade, Byron said gently. This place is incredible, and what you've built here shows how strong and resourceful you are. But if we're going to fight back against the people who did this to you, we need better security and more resources than we can have here. Alden leaned forward, his expression intense. And then what? Once we're at this ranch, what's the next step? Byron met his eyes steadily. Then we start making noise. We document everything. We find other people who can help us. And we make sure your story gets told in a way that can't be ignored or covered up. That sounds dangerous, Ceres said quietly. It is dangerous, Byron acknowledged. But staying hidden forever is dangerous too. And doing nothing while these people continue whatever they're doing, that's the most dangerous choice of all. Juniper reached over and took her father's hand. When do we leave? Soon, Byron said. Within the next few days. But first, we're going to make sure we have everything we need and that everyone is ready. As they began to plan their departure from the warehouse that had been both prison and sanctuary, Byron felt the weight of responsibility settling more firmly on his shoulders. These 9 remarkable young people were trusting him with their lives, their futures, their hope of ever seeing their families again. He couldn't let them down. The decision to move to Finchbow's ranch had been made, but the logistics proved more complex than anyone had anticipated. It wasn't just about transporting 9 young people and their possessions. It was about carefully dismantling a life they'd built from nothing while ensuring their movements remained undetected. Byron found himself spending entire evenings at the warehouse now, not just visiting but truly becoming part of their daily rhythm. On Tuesday, he arrived to find Cyril teaching Ira how to calculate electrical loads for their solar panel system. On Wednesday, he walked into an impromptu history lesson where Kathleen was explaining the constitutional principles behind whistleblower protections to the younger kids. "You're building a school here," he told Georgia as she organized their collection of salvaged textbooks and library discards. "We had to," she replied simply. "We couldn't stop learning just because they wanted us to disappear." It was on Thursday evening that Byron truly understood how deeply he'd become invested in their collective future. He'd brought supplies for their move, but instead of immediately planning logistics, he found himself helping Dahlia with a makeshift science experiment she designed to test water purity levels. "My mom taught me that knowledge is the one thing nobody can take away from you," Dahlia said as she carefully measured pH levels. "Even when they took everything else, our families, our names, our entire lives, they couldn't take what we'd already learned." "Is that why you keep studying?" Byron asked, watching her precise movements with pride that surprised him with its intensity. "Partly," she nodded. "But also because someday, when we're free, I want to be ready to help other kids. Kids who might be facing what we faced." The statement hit Byron like a revelation. These young people weren't just surviving their ordeal, they were transforming it into purpose. They were planning to use their suffering to prevent others from experiencing the same thing. That night, as they shared dinner around their familiar circle, Byron noticed something that made his chest tight with emotion. Without anyone making a conscious decision about it, the seating arrangement had shifted over the past week. Initially, the kids had sat together with Byron positioned slightly outside their group. Now Juniper sat to his right, Ira to his left. And the others had naturally arranged themselves so that he was integrated into their circle rather than adjacent to it. He was becoming their family, just as they were becoming his. "Uncle Finch called me back today," Byron said, setting down his spoon. "He's ready for us whenever we are. But he also wanted me to ask you something." 9 faces turned toward him with varying expressions of curiosity and concern. He wanted to know if you'd be comfortable with him knowing the whole truth about your situation, or if you'd prefer that he just think you're kids who need a safe place to stay for a while. The question prompted an immediate huddle among the group. Byron watched them debate in low voices, seeing the democratic decision-making process they'd developed during their months together. No decisions were made without consensus. Everyone's voice carried equal weight, from 15-year-old Alden down to 7-year-old Ira. "We think," Kathleen said when they'd finished their discussion, "that he should know everything. If we're going to ask for his help, he deserves to understand what he's risking." "Are you sure?" Byron asked. "Once he knows, there's no going back. He'll be involved whether he wants to be or not, like you are." Juniper asked quietly. The question caught Byron off guard. Until that moment, he hadn't really considered the magnitude of what he'd taken on. Finding his daughter alive should have been the end of the story. Instead, it had become the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous. "Yes," he said after a moment, "like I am." "Do you regret it?" Ira asked, her small voice cutting straight to the heart of fears he hadn't even acknowledged he was carrying. Byron looked around the circle, taking in each face that had become precious to him over the past week. Kids who weren't his by blood, but who had somehow become his responsibility, his pride, his reason for getting up in the morning, and his last thought before sleep. "The only thing I regret," he said honestly, "is that it took me 2 years to find you." The preparation for their departure became a family project in ways that both touched and worried Byron. The kids had accumulated remarkably little in terms of personal possessions, a consequence of their circumstances, but they'd created detailed documentation of everything they'd learned about their captors and the facilities where they'd been held. More significantly, they'd developed relationships with several people in the warehouse district who had helped them survive without asking too many questions. Mrs. Chun, an elderly woman who ran a small grocery store nearby, had sold them supplies at cost and never questioned why kids were shopping alone. Brooke Sterling, a security guard who worked the night shift at a manufacturing plant across the street, had made sure their section of the district stayed safe from vandals and drug dealers. "We can't just disappear without saying goodbye," Ceres insisted during one of their planning sessions. "These people helped us when they didn't have to. They deserve to know we're okay. But we can't tell them where we're going," Alden added. "For their safety and ours." They developed a plan that was both touching and heartbreaking in its necessity. Brief thank you notes that expressed gratitude without providing details. Small gifts made from things they'd crafted during their months in hiding. Hugs and promises to remember people who had shown kindness to kids, who couldn't even reveal their real names. It was Juniper who suggested the most important addition to their departure preparations. "Daddy," she said on Friday evening as they worked together to pack the most critical of their documents, "what if something happens to us during the move? What if we get separated or caught or—" "Nothing's going to happen," Byron said automatically. But she shook her head. "You can't promise that. None of us can. But if something does happen, someone should know our story. Someone should have copies of everything we've documented." She was right, and he knew it. They were about to become more visible, more vulnerable, in ways that increased their risk, even as it moved them toward potential freedom. "What are you suggesting?" "I think," she said carefully, "that we should send copies of everything to someone trustworthy. Someone who's not directly involved, but who would know what to do with the information if we disappeared again." Over the next hour, they developed a plan that felt both wise and terrifying. Detailed packets of information would be mailed to 3 separate recipients: a journalist who had a reputation for investigating government cover-ups, a civil rights attorney who specialized in cases involving wrongful imprisonment, and Byron's brother Cole, who lived in California and had the resources to hire private investigators if needed. The packets would be mailed with instructions to open them only if the senders failed to check in within 2 weeks. It was insurance against the worst-case scenario, but it also felt like writing their own obituaries. As they sealed the envelopes and prepared to walk to 3 different post offices to mail them, Byron realized something that both thrilled and terrified him. Over the course of 1 week, these 9 remarkable young people had stopped being his daughter's situation and had become his family. Their safety wasn't just important to him, it was essential. Their futures weren't just something he hoped to help secure, they were something he'd sacrifice, anything to protect. He was no longer just a man trying to save his daughter. He was a father figure to 9 children who deserved every chance at happiness and freedom he could possibly give them. And tomorrow, they would begin the most dangerous part of their journey toward claiming those chances. As they walked back to the warehouse for their final night there, Ira slipped her small hand into his and looked up at him with trust that made his heart ache. "Mr. Byron," she said softly, "when this is all over and we're all home with our families, will you still be our friend?" "Sweetheart," he replied, squeezing her hand gently, "I'm going to be much more than your friend. I'm going to be part of your family forever." It was a promise that felt as natural as breathing and as permanent as the stars overhead. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The black sedan appeared on Industrial Row at 6:47 a.m. on Saturday morning, just as Byron was loading the last of their essential supplies into his truck. He spotted it immediately, too clean, too new, too purposeful for a street where most vehicles were work trucks and aging commuter cars, belonging to the early shift workers at the remaining factories. Ceres saw it too. She'd been posted as their early morning lookout, positioned at a window with a clear view of all 3 approaches to the warehouse. Her whistle, 2 sharp notes followed by a long one, sent an immediate chill through everyone in the building. "Black car, government plates," she called out in the coded language they'd developed. 2 occupants, both wearing suits. The transformation was instantaneous and heartbreaking. In the space of 30 seconds, 9 young people who had been Laughing and joking about their upcoming move to the ranch became a tactical unit focused entirely on survival. Personal belongings were abandoned in favor of essential documents. Escape routes were confirmed. Emergency signals were established. Byron watched in amazement and growing dread as they executed procedures they'd clearly practiced dozens of times. This wasn't panic, it was preparation meeting reality. "Dad," Juniper said quietly, using the word naturally for the first time since their reunion. "You need to leave, now. Take the truck and go, and we'll meet you at the backup location tonight." "Absolutely not," Byron replied, checking the load on his truck one more time. "We're leaving together, or we're staying together." "Mr. Evans," Alden said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd kept 8 other people alive for months. "With respect, you don't understand how this works. They can't afford to let you walk away now that you know about us. If they capture you with us, they'll make you disappear too." The sedan had stopped about 2 blocks away, positioning itself with a clear view of the warehouse entrances, but not close enough to be obviously threatening. Classic surveillance positioning. Professional. "How long do we have?" Barron asked, accepting that these kids knew more about evading capture than he ever would. "Depends on what they're here for," Caitlin said, studying the vehicle through a pair of binoculars they'd apparently acquired sometime during their months in hiding. "If it's just reconnaissance, they might watch for hours. If they're planning to move on us... She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy. "In the morning air." "There's a second car," Cyril announced from his position at the rear window. "White van, 3 blocks east." "They're trying to box us in." Byron felt his blood turn to ice. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidental. Someone had discovered their location, their routines, possibly even their plans to leave. "How?" he asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. "Could be anything," Georgia said, methodically destroying papers that couldn't be allowed to fall into the wrong hands. Facial recognition software, license plate readers, cell phone tracking, old-fashioned human surveillance. Or, Dahlia added grimly, someone talked. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. For months, these 9 young people had survived by trusting only each other. The introduction of an adult into their group, even Juniper's father, had created new vulnerabilities that none of them had fully acknowledged until this moment. "Nobody talked," Ira said firmly, her 7-year-old voice cutting through the tension with surprising authority. "Nobody here would do that, which means they found us some other way." Byron found himself both proud of and heartbroken by the loyalty these children showed each other, even in the face of immediate danger. They'd created something precious in this abandoned warehouse, a family built on absolute trust, and now that sanctuary was being threatened. "The question," Alden said, "is what we do about it." "We run," Sari said immediately. "We grab the essentials and we go out the back exit, split up, meet at rally point 3. "No," Juniper said, surprising everyone. "Running is what we've been doing for months. It's what they expect us to do. Maybe it's time to try something different." Byron looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw something that took his breath away. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was ready to fight. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking that they're here because they know we're planning something. They probably don't know exactly what, but they know enough to be worried. Which means we have something they want, or something they're afraid of." Caitlin lowered her binoculars and turned from the window. "The documentation. Everything we've gathered about the facilities, the people involved, the patterns of disappearances. If that information got out... it would expose the entire operation." Alden finished. "Not just our situation, but potentially dozens of other cases we haven't even discovered yet." The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic and the closer, more ominous sound of car doors closing. Through the windows they could see figures moving toward their building, not rushing, but advancing with the measured pace of people who were confident their target had nowhere to go. There's something else, Cyril said from his position at the electronic station they'd built near the rear of the warehouse. I've been monitoring emergency radio frequencies since yesterday. There was unusual military air traffic last night. Helicopters, transport planes, more than normal. They're escalating, Georgia said quietly. Whatever timeline they were operating on, something's accelerated it. Byron felt the pieces clicking together in his mind with horrible clarity. They're not just here to recapture you. They're here to shut down whatever operation you've uncovered, permanently. Which means, Dahlia said with devastating logic, that other people are in danger too. People who don't even know they're in danger. The moral weight of their situation crashed down on Byron like a physical force. It wasn't just about protecting 9 remarkable young people anymore. It was about exposing a conspiracy that was apparently much larger and more dangerous than any of them had realized. The sound of footsteps on gravel was getting closer. New plan, Byron said, making a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Juniper, how many copies of your documentation do you have? 3 complete sets, plus the packets we mailed yesterday. Good. Alden, how many ways out of this? Building? 4, but they probably have at least 2 covered by now. Byron nodded, his mind racing through possibilities. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to split into 3 groups. Each group takes a complete set of documentation and heads to a different destination. That way, even if they capture some of us, the evidence survives. I don't like splitting up, Ira said, her small voice carrying all the fear of a child who'd already lost one family. I don't like it either, Byron admitted. But I like the alternative even less. Through the front windows, they could see figures positioning themselves around the building. Professional movements, coordinated timing. These weren't local law enforcement officers responding to a routine call. These were military personnel conducting a carefully planned operation. Group assignments, Alden said, taking charge with the natural authority that had kept them alive this long. Fastest runners in Group 1, Ceres, Cyril, and Ira. You take the storm drainage route to Rally Point 2. Group 2, Caitlin, Georgia, and Dahlia. You take the rooftop route to Rally Point 4. Group 3 is me, Juniper. And ... Byron paused, looking around at the remaining kids. Me, said a voice he didn't expect. Cole Vance, one of the middle kids who rarely spoke up during planning sessions, stepped forward. I know the underground utility tunnels better than anyone. I can get you to the industrial district without being seen. It was a brave offer from a 14-year-old who'd been quietly heroic for months without seeking recognition. Cole, are you sure? Juniper asked. I'm sure. Besides, someone needs to make sure your dad doesn't get lost trying to keep up with us. Despite the terror of their situation, several of the kids actually smiled at that. It was a moment of lightness. In what might be their last few minutes together, and Byron treasured it even as his heart broke. The sound of boots on concrete was now coming from multiple directions. Equipment distribution, Caitlin said, moving with efficient precision. Each group gets a radio, emergency cache, and a copy of the master document file. Rally time is sunset at location 1, but only if it's safe. If anyone gets captured, the others continue the mission. What mission? Byron asked. Getting the truth out, Juniper said simply. Whatever happens to us, the documentation has to reach the people who can expose what's been happening. As they made final preparations to separate, Byron realized that he was witnessing something extraordinary. 9 young people who should have been traumatized into helplessness by what they'd endured had instead become a resistant cell. They'd turned their suffering into strength, their fear into determination, their desperation into purpose. The footsteps stopped outside the main entrance. Time to go, Alden whispered before they separated. Something remarkable happened. Without anyone suggesting it, All 9 kids moved toward Byron, one by one. They hugged him quick, fierce embraces that carried all the emotion they couldn't afford to express in words. "Thank you for finding us," Ira whispered. "Thank you for believing us," Dahlia added. "Thank you for not giving up," said Cyril, when it was over. Byron looked around at faces that had become as precious to him as his own daughters. They were trusting him with more than their safety. They were trusting him with their hope that justice might actually be possible. "See you at sunset," he said quietly. "See you at sunset," they echoed, and then they scattered into the morning. Shadows carrying with them the evidence that might finally expose the truth about what had been done to them, and the courage to make sure that truth reached the people who could act on it. As Bayran followed Cole and Juniper toward a utility access panel he hadn't even known existed, he heard the warehouse door being forced open behind them. Shouts, radio chatter, the sound of heavy boots on concrete. They'd escaped. For now. But as they crawled through a drainage tunnel that smelled of rust and decades of accumulated debris, Byron knew that their real fight was just beginning. The utility tunnel stretched ahead of them like a concrete throat, swallowing the weak beam of Cole's flashlight into endless darkness. Behind them, the sounds of the warehouse search grew fainter but more ominous, systematic, methodical, the kind of search conducted by people who knew exactly what they were looking for and had all the time in the world to find it. Byron's knees were already aching from crawling through the cramped space, but Cole moved ahead of them with the fluid confidence of someone who had mapped every inch of these underground passages during long months of preparation for exactly this scenario. Juniper followed close behind her father, one hand occasionally touching his back as if to reassure herself he was still there. "How much farther?" Byron whispered, though the concrete walls seemed to amplify even the quietest sounds. "Quarter mile to the first junction," Cole replied without slowing down. "Then we surface near the old textile mill and reassess." They crawled in silence for another 10 minutes before Cole suddenly stopped, holding up a hand for quiet. In the distance, echoing through the tunnel system, came the unmistakable sound of voices and footsteps. Multiple sets, moving with purpose. "They know about the tunnels," Juniper said, her voice barely audible. Cole's expression was grim in the flashlight's glow. "They know about everything. Someone's been watching us for longer than we realized." The implications hit Byron like a physical blow. If their pursuers knew about the tunnels, they probably knew about the rally points too. Which meant the other group's 6 kids who had become like his own family over the past week were walking into traps. "We have to warn them," he said, reaching for the radio Caitlin had given him. "No," Cole said firmly, placing a hand on Byron's wrist. "Radio traffic will give away our position. And if they've been monitoring us, they're probably listening to our frequencies. Then what do we do?" It was Juniper who answered, her voice carrying a weight that no 11-year-old should ever have to bear. "We stick to the plan. We get the documentation to safety, and we trust that the others are doing the same." They continued through the tunnels, but the sounds of pursuit seemed to be getting closer. At the first major junction, Cole led them up a maintenance ladder to a drainage grate that opened onto an alley behind the abandoned textile mill. The morning sun felt blindingly bright after the darkness of the tunnels. "Rally Point 2 is compromised," Cole said immediately, pointing to a white van parked at the far end of the alley. "They're covering all our predetermined locations." Byron felt a crushing sense of helplessness wash over him. These kids had spent months developing survival strategies, backup plans, emergency protocols. But their opponents had resources and authority that made their careful preparations seem tragically inadequate. "What now?" he asked. "Now we improvise," Juniper said, but her voice carried a tremor that hadn't been there in the warehouse. For the first time since their reunion, she sounded like the scared child she actually was rather than the resilient survivor she'd been forced to become. They made their way through a series of back alleys and abandoned lots, using skills Cole had apparently learned through bitter necessity. But with each street they crossed, each corner they turned, the evidence of systematic surveillance became more obvious. Black sedans parked in positions that provided clear sight lines, unmarked vans with tinted windows, even what appeared to be ordinary maintenance workers who spoke into radio headsets with military precision. "It's not just about us anymore," Cole said as they crouched behind a dumpster, watching yet another suspicious vehicle cruise slowly past their hiding spot. "They're mobilizing everything. This is bigger than just recapturing 9 kids." Juniper pulled out the folder containing their most crucial documentation photos, witness statements, detailed maps of the facilities where they'd been held, names and descriptions of their captors. 2 years of careful investigation and meticulous record keeping, all compressed into evidence that could expose a conspiracy of staggering scope. "Maybe," she said quietly, "it's time to stop hiding." Stop hiding. Both Byron and Cole turned to look at her. In the harsh morning light, she looked simultaneously younger and older than her 11 years, a child who had been forced to make adult decisions, carrying adult burdens, facing adult consequences. "What do you mean?" Byron asked, though he suspected he already knew. "I mean, maybe running isn't the answer anymore. Maybe it's time to make them chase us in the open, where people can see what's happening." It was a terrifying suggestion. Everything the kids had done for months had been focused on staying invisible, staying safe, staying alive by avoiding detection. Going public would make them exponentially more vulnerable, but it would also make their situation visible to the outside world. "Juniper," Cole said carefully, "if we surface now, if we make ourselves visible, there's no going back. They won't just disappear us. They'll have to silence us permanently." "They're already trying to do that," she replied with devastating logic. "At least this way, other people will know we existed. Other people will know what happened to us." Byron felt his heart breaking as he listened to his daughter, his brilliant, brave, remarkable daughter calmly discussing the possibility of sacrificing her life to expose the truth. This wasn't how childhood was supposed to work. This wasn't how parenthood was supposed to work. "There has to be another way," he said desperately. "Dad," Juniper said, reaching out to take his hand, "2 years ago, they stole my life. They stole all our lives. But we survived, and we found each other, and we figured out how to fight back. Now we have a choice. We can keep running and hiding and hoping that someday someone else will save us. Or we can save ourselves by making sure the truth gets out, no matter what happens to us." The sound of approaching helicopters punctuated her words. Military aircraft, flying low search patterns over the industrial district. The net was closing, and their options were disappearing with each passing minute. Cole was monitoring police and emergency radio frequencies on a small scanner he'd pulled from his backpack. "Multiple agencies involved," he reported. "FBI, local. Law enforcement, National Guard units on standby. They're calling it a terrorist threat. They're calling us terrorists." Byron asked, incredulous. "It's the cover story," Juniper said matter-of-factly. "Easier to justify overwhelming force against terrorists than against kids who stumbled onto the wrong information." As if to underscore her point, the sound of the helicopters grew louder, closer. Through gaps between buildings, they could see aircraft circling in systematic patterns, methodically covering every possible hiding place in the district. "Decision time," Cole said quietly. Byron looked at these 2 remarkable young people, his daughter, and a boy who had become like a son to him in the space of a few days, and realized that they were right. They couldn't keep running forever. Eventually, their luck would run out, their resources would be exhausted, their will to keep fighting would be broken, but they could control how their story ended. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. Juniper opened the documentation folder and pulled out a single photograph, a group picture of all 9 kids that they'd taken just days earlier. smiling and laughing in their warehouse home. On the back, in her careful handwriting, were their real names, their supposed dates of death, and a brief summary of what had been done to them. "We find the biggest crowd we can," she said. "Someplace with lots of witnesses, lots of cameras. We make ourselves visible. We tell our story, and we make sure everyone knows who we are and what happened to us." "And then?" Cole asked. "And then whatever happens, happens. But at least the truth will be out there." It was a plan born of desperation, but tempered with courage that took Byron's breath away. These kids had faced horrors that would have broken most adults, but they hadn't just survived. They'd found a way to transform their suffering into purpose. A new sound cut through the morning air sirens. Multiple vehicles, getting closer. Their pursuers were tightening the search pattern, using overwhelming force to eliminate any possibility of escape. "Where?" Byron asked, accepting the inevitable. "Saturday Farmers Market," Cole said immediately. "Downtown Plaza. Hundreds of people, local news coverage, lots of smartphones. If we can get there and make our presence known before they stop us, the whole world will see." Juniper finished. They moved quickly but carefully through the remaining blocks between their hiding spot and downtown, using every piece of urban camouflage they'd learned during their months underground. But as they got closer to the plaza, the weight of what they were about to do settled over them like a heavy blanket. 3 blocks from the farmers market, they stopped in the shadow of an old church. The sounds of normal Saturday morning life drifted toward them, families shopping for vegetables, children laughing, vendors calling out their wares. The ordinary world that had continued existing while they fought for survival in the shadows. "Dad," Juniper said, looking up at him with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone her age. "If this goes wrong, if they capture us before we can tell our story, I need you to know something." "What, sweetheart?" "I need you to know that finding you, having you believe in us and fight for us, that was worth everything. Even if we don't win, even if we don't make it home, you gave us back something they tried to take away." "What's that?" "Hope," Byron pulled his daughter close, holding her tight while Cole kept watch at the corner. In 2 blocks, they would step into the light and make themselves targets. They would tell their story to anyone who would listen, knowing that doing so might cost them their lives. But they would tell it as a family, not just as survivors, but as people who had chosen courage over safety, truth over security, hope over fear. The farmers market buzzed with activity just ahead. It was time to stop hiding. It was time to fight back. The Millbrook Valley Saturday Farmers Market was in full swing when B ran. Juniper and Cole emerged from the alley behind Henderson's hardware store. The plaza buzzed with the kind of cheerful chaos that marked weekend mornings in small towns across America. Vendors arranging produce displays, families with strollers navigating between booths, teenagers working summer jobs while checking their phones. It looked like sanctuary. It looked like normalcy. It looked like the last place on earth where a conspiracy involving disappeared children and military cover-ups could intrude, which made it perfect. "Local news crew," Cole observed, nodding toward a van with Channel 7 logos parked near the fountain. "They're doing their usual weekend community interest segment. Channel 7 streams live to their website," Juniper added, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were about to do. "Whatever happens here will be recorded and broadcast." Byron took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the documentation folder in his jacket pocket. In a few minutes, the contents of that folder, photos, testimonies, evidence of a conspiracy that had stolen 9 young lives, would either be exposed to the world or buried forever along with them. "Last chance to reconsider," he said, though. He already knew what their answer would be. "No," Juniper said simply. "We've been quiet for too long." They moved into the crowd, trying to look like any other family enjoying a Saturday morning outing. But Byron's trained eye could already spot the anomalies. Too many people in business casual clothing for a farmer's market. Too many individuals. Standing alone rather than shopping with families. Too many earpieces and subtle hand signals. The net had found them. Northwest corner, by the coffee stand, Cole murmured. 2 men in suits, watching the crowd. Food truck row, pretending to read menus, Juniper added. At least 3 more. They were surrounded, but not yet intercepted. Their pursuers were waiting for something, probably for them to move away from the crowd, or for backup to arrive, or for orders about how to handle a situation that had suddenly become very public. Now or never, Byron said. They walked directly toward the Channel 7 news crew, where a cheerful reporter in a bright blue blazer was interviewing the owner of a local honey farm about sustainable beekeeping practices. The camera operator was a young woman who looked like she might have been barely out of college, focused on getting good shots of the honey display. Juniper stepped into the frame just as the beekeeper was explaining the importance of native flowers for honey production. "Excuse me," she said politely but clearly, looking directly into the camera. "My name is Juniper Shaw, and I've been dead for 2 years." The reporter blinked, confused but professional enough to keep smiling. "I'm sorry, sweetheart, we're in the middle of my name is Juniper Shaw," Juniper repeated, louder now, her voice carrying across the immediate area and causing nearby shoppers to turn and stare. "I supposedly died in a bus accident on November 15th, 2 years ago. Except there was no bus accident, and I'm not dead, and there are 8 other kids who aren't dead either." The camera operator, to her credit, kept filming. The reporter's professional smile faltered as she began to realize something unusual was happening. "Sweetheart, I think maybe you're confused. I'm not confused." Juniper pulled out the folder and opened it, displaying the group photograph of all 9 kids. "These are my friends. Alden Thorne supposedly died in a hiking accident 3 years ago. Kathleen Chavez, car crash 2 years ago. Georgia Schmidt, train derailment. All fake. All of us were taken because we discovered evidence of illegal chemical testing in this area. The crowd around them was growing, drawn by the unusual scene and the intensity in Juniper's young voice. Smartphones were appearing, pointed in their direction. Social media posts were probably already going live. That's when Byron saw them. At the edge of the plaza, moving with unmistakable purpose, came men in dark tactical gear. Not trying to blend in anymore, not pretending to be casual shoppers. They were closing in fast, and they clearly didn't care who saw them. "Military personnel approaching," Cole said quietly, but his voice carried to the people nearby. "They're here to silence us." The reporter was looking around now, finally understanding that she'd stumbled into something much bigger than a community interest story. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying my daughter was declared dead to cover up a government conspiracy," Byron said, stepping forward and putting a protective arm around Juniper. "I'm saying 9 children have been missing for years while their families grieved for them. And I'm saying the people responsible are about to try to silence us permanently." The tactical team was 50 yards away and closing fast. But something unexpected was happening in the crowd. Instead of scattering or backing away, people were moving closer. Parents pulled their children behind them but didn't retreat. Teenagers held up their phones, streaming live video to Instagram and TikTok. Vendors abandoned their booths to see what was happening. "Is this real?" Someone called out. "Where are the other children?" Another voice demanded. The reporter, whatever her limitations, was experienced enough to recognize a major story when it literally walked into her shot. "Can you prove these allegations?" Juniper opened the folder fully, displaying photographs of the facility where they'd been held, documents bearing official seals, detailed maps and testimony. 2 years of evidence, she said clearly. Names, dates, locations, personnel involved, everything. The tactical team was 20 yards away when something remarkable happened. Mrs. Chun, the elderly woman from the grocery store near the warehouse, pushed through the crowd. Behind her came Brooke Sterling, the security guard who had helped keep them safe. Behind him came other faces, people who had helped 9 supposedly dead children survive in an abandoned warehouse without asking too many questions. "I know these kids," Mrs. Chun announced in a voice that carried across the plaza. "Good kids, scared kids, hiding from something terrible. They've been living in the warehouse district for months," Brooks added. "Keeping to themselves, not bothering anyone, just trying to survive." The tactical team stopped, uncertain. Their mission had been to apprehend targets quietly, without witnesses. But now they were facing dozens of phones recording their every move, a live news broadcast, and a crowd that was growing more supportive and more protective by the minute. That's when the miracle happened. From different directions around the plaza, other figures emerged from the crowd. A girl with short black hair, Kathleen Chavez, moving with 3 other kids. A tall boy leading 2 more children, Alden Thorne, with Ceres and Ira close behind. They'd made it. All of them. Despite the surveillance, despite the overwhelming force arrayed against them, despite every obstacle their captors had put in their path, all 9 kids had found their way to the same moment, the same place, the same choice to stand up and tell their truth. 9 kids, the reporter said into her microphone, her voice filled with awe. 9 children who were supposedly dead, all here, all alive. The crowd's murmur grew louder, more agitated. Someone called out, "Where are their families? Why haven't their families been told they're alive?" Another voice, "Who has the authority to fake children's deaths?" The tactical team leader was speaking urgently into his radio, clearly receiving instructions he didn't like. The situation had spiraled far beyond their ability to control quietly. That's when the next surprise came. A black sedan pulled up at the edge of the plaza, and out stepped a woman in a military uniform with enough ribbons and insignia to indicate very high rank. She walked directly toward the news crew, her expression unreadable, but her posture suggesting someone who was about to make a decision that would change everything. "Colonel Patricia Vance," she announced, stopping directly in front of the camera. "United States Army." The plaza fell silent. "These children," she continued, looking directly at the 9 kids who had somehow found each other and found their courage, are heroes. They uncovered evidence of an illegal experimental program that violated every treaty and ethical standard this country claims to uphold. The tactical team leader stepped forward. "Ma'am, our orders, your orders, Colonel," Vance said without taking her eyes off the camera, "are now rescinded. By direct order of the Secretary of Defense, Operation Clearwater is officially terminated. These children are under federal protection, and their families are being notified immediately." She turned to address the crowd directly. "What you've witnessed here today is 9 young people showing more courage than most adults ever will. They deserve to go home. They deserve justice. And they deserve a country that's worthy of their bravery." The cheers started small, one person clapping, then another, but within seconds the entire plaza erupted in applause. Phones continued recording, capturing not just the revelation of a conspiracy, but its public downfall. Juniper looked up at her father, tears streaming down her face. "Is it over?" "It's over," he said, pulling her close. "You're going home." All around them, 9 remarkable young people who had refused to stay silenced were finally safe. The truth was out, and it was spreading faster than any cover-up could contain it. 3 months after the farmers market revelation that had made international headlines, Behran stood in the community center gymnasium, watching something that still felt like a miracle every time he witnessed it. 9 young people who had been declared dead were not just alive, they were thriving. The Millbrook 9, as the media had dubbed them, had become symbols of resilience and truth-telling that inspired people around the world. But more importantly, they had become what they'd always deserved to be: regular kids with families who loved them, communities that supported them, and futures bright with possibility. Tonight was the first annual Truth and Courage celebration, an event the town had organized to honor not just the 9 kids, but all the people who had helped them survive and find their voices. The gymnasium was packed with families, reporters, government officials, and ordinary citizens who had been moved by their story. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mayor Patricia Hendricks announced from the makeshift stage, "I'd like to welcome some very special guests." One by one, the 9 kids walked onto the stage, but they looked completely different from the cautious, haunted survivors who had emerged from that warehouse 3 months ago. They looked like teenagers at a school assembly, confident, relaxed, occasionally giggling at inside jokes. Alden Thorne, now 18 and preparing for college in the fall, served as their unofficial spokesperson. 3 months ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the gymnasium, we were kids who had learned to live in the shadows, to trust no one except each other, to believe that silence was the only way to stay safe. He gestured to his 8 companions. Tonight, we're here to thank the people who taught us that truth is stronger than fear, that courage is contagious, and that families can be chosen as well as born. The applause was thunderous, but Byron was focused on individual faces in the crowd. There was Mrs. Chun, beaming with pride as if all 9 kids were her own grandchildren. Brooks Sterling, the security guard who had risked his job to help them, now working as a youth coordinator for a program supporting at-risk teenagers. Colonel Vance, who had defied orders to do the right thing and was now heading a congressional task force on government accountability. But most importantly, there were the families. Caitlin's parents sat in the front row, her mother occasionally reaching up to touch her daughter's hand as if still convincing herself this was real. Mr. and Mrs. Schmidt flanked Georgia, both of them glowing with the kind of happiness that comes after the deepest grief has been transformed into the deepest gratitude. Dahlia's grandmother, who had never stopped believing her granddaughter was alive somewhere, kept wiping away tears of joy. The Hayes family had brought what looked like half their extended family to witness Ceres's public acknowledgement. Ira's parents sat with 3 other sets of parents, all of them bonded by the shared experience of getting their children back from the dead. "We'd like to present some special recognition tonight," Juniper said, stepping forward to the microphone. At 30 now, she had grown several inches and gained the confidence that came from having her voice heard and believed. "First," she continued, "to the people who helped us survive when we had nowhere else to go, Mrs. Chun, Mr. Sterling, and dozens of others who showed kindness to kids they thought were just homeless runaways. You saved our lives." More applause, but Juniper held up her hand for quiet. "Second, to Colonel Vance and the investigators who are making sure that what happened to us never happens to anyone else. The program that stole our childhoods has been completely shut down, and the people responsible are facing justice. Justice." This brought cheers from the crowd. The legal proceedings had been swift and thorough once the story broke. Operation Clearwater had been exposed as an illegal human experimentation program that had violated countless federal laws and international treaties. Dozens of officials had been arrested, and congressional hearings were ongoing. But most importantly, Juniper said, her voice growing softer, we want to thank the man who never stopped looking for his daughter, and who ended up finding all of us. The spotlight swung to where Bayron sat with his extended family, because that's what they'd become. Cole Vance, whom he'd officially taken in as a foster child when the boy's original family proved unable to cope with his return. 3 other kids whose family situations had been complicated by their long absence and who spent most weekends at his house anyway. Byron Evans, Alden announced, taught us that family isn't just about blood. It's about showing up every day and choosing to believe in each other even when the world says you're crazy for hoping. Byron felt his face flush as the crowd rose in a standing ovation. He hadn't expected this kind of recognition. His motivation had been simple: find his daughter and bring her home. Everything else had just followed naturally. As the formal ceremony continued, Byron's mind wandered to the smaller, more personal changes that had transformed all their lives. Juniper was thriving in her new middle school, where she'd been placed in advanced classes and had already won the regional science fair with a project on environmental monitoring, a more positive application of the research skills that had gotten her into trouble in the first place. She came home every day with stories about friends, teachers, normal teenage drama that felt like the most precious gift in the world. The other kids were adjusting at their own pace. Some, like Caitlin and Georgia, had slipped back into their family dynamics relatively easily. Others, like Cyril and Dahlia, were still learning how to trust that their safety was permanent, that the adults in their lives wouldn't disappear again. All of them came to Byron's house for dinner every Sunday, a tradition that had started accidentally when he'd offered to cook for everyone after their first week back home, and had continued because none of them wanted to break the connection they'd forged during their hardest times. The Evans extended family dinner, as they'd started calling it, had become the anchor point of all their weeks. They cooked together, shared stories about their new normal lives, and gradually processed the trauma they'd endured together. More than that, they'd created something beautiful from their shared experience. Alden was planning to study constitutional law, with the goal of preventing future government overreach. Caitlin had started a blog about children's rights that had attracted readers from around the world. Georgia was developing sustainable gardening programs for schools, turning her survival skills into educational opportunities. Each of them was transforming their suffering into service, their trauma into purpose. "Before we close tonight," Juniper said from the stage, "we want to share something we've been working on together." The lights dimmed and a video began playing on the screen behind them. It showed all 9 kids in what was clearly Byron's backyard, sitting around a picnic table covered with photo albums, documents, and a laptop computer. "We're creating a foundation," Caitlin's voice narrated over footage of them working together. "The Millbrook Foundation for Missing Children will help families who are searching for lost kids and help kids who are hiding from unsafe situations." Video showed them at a groundbreaking ceremony for what would become a resource center, then cut to footage of them speaking at schools, sharing their story with other young people. "We learned," Alden's voice continued, "that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about deciding that something matters more than your fear." The final shot was of all 9 kids standing with Byron in front of the community center, holding a banner that read, "Truth, Courage, Family, Hope." As the video ended and the lights came back up, the audience was on its feet again. But Byron was looking at the stage where 9 remarkable young people stood holding hands, their faces bright with genuine happiness. They'd started as victims of an unconscionable conspiracy. They'd survived as a chosen family forged in desperation. But they'd emerged as something even more powerful, champions for justice, advocates for truth, living proof that love could triumph over even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. After the ceremony, as families mingled and kids took selfies and reporters conducted interviews, Byron found himself in conversation with Dr. Sarah Martinez, a family therapist who had been working with all 9 kids since their return. "How are they really doing?" he asked quietly, watching Juniper laugh with her friends while simultaneously keeping an eye on Ira, who still sometimes felt overwhelmed in large crowds. "Better than anyone expected," Dr. Martinez replied. "The trauma is real, and it will take years to fully process. But they have something most trauma survivors don't have, which is, they have each other, they have you, and they have proof that their suffering led to something meaningful. That's incredibly powerful for healing." As the evening wound down and families began to head home, the 9 kids gathered around Byron one more time. "Same time next Sunday?" Dahlia asked, though she already knew the answer. "Wouldn't miss it," Byron replied, pulling her into a hug. "Can we try that new dessert recipe Ira found?" Cole asked. As long as you help with the dishes, Byron laughed. One by one, they hugged him goodbye and went to their families' cars. But they moved with the easy confidence of kids who knew they were loved, who knew they had multiple homes, who knew that their chosen family would always be there for them. As Byron walked to his truck with Juniper and Cole, the two who lived with him full-time now, he reflected on how completely his life had changed. 3 months ago, he'd been a man defined by loss, spending every day searching for a daughter he refused to believe was dead. Now he was a father to not just one remarkable child, but to 9 kids who had taught him that family was about choice, as much as chance, that courage was contagious, and that love could literally move mountains, or at least expose government conspiracies and bring justice to those who thought they were untouchable. "Dad," Juniper said as they reached the truck, "are you happy?" It was such a simple question, but it hit him with unexpected force. For 2 years after her supposed death, he'd thought happiness was impossible. For months after finding her, he'd been too focused on survival and safety to think about happiness. But now, looking at his daughter healthy, safe, thriving, surrounded by a chosen family that had become as precious to him as blood relatives, he realized that happiness wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. "Sweetheart," he said, opening the truck door for her, "I'm the happiest man alive." And for the first time in years, that was absolutely, completely true. 5 years later, Byron stood in the gleaming lobby of the Millbrook Foundation for Missing Children, watching his daughter, now 18 and preparing for her freshman year, at MIT, give a tour to a group of congressional staffers who had come to study their model for family reunification services. "The key insight," Juniper was explaining to the group, "is that missing children aren't just statistics. They're someone's whole world. And the families searching for them aren't just cases to be managed. They're experts on their own children, who should be partners in every investigation." Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Byron could see the memorial garden where they'd planted 9 trees, one for each of the Millbrook 9, surrounded by dozens of smaller plantings representing the other missing children their foundation had helped reunite with their families. The latest count was 247 successful reunifications, with another 89 cases actively being investigated. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story, the real legacy of that terrifying morning in the farmer's market 5 years ago wasn't just about the children they'd helped bring home, or even the corrupt officials who had been prosecuted and imprisoned. It was about the fundamental shift in how society thought about missing children, government accountability, and the power of ordinary people to demand extraordinary justice. "Mr. Evans?" A young woman with a press badge approached him. "Jessica Chun from the Washington Post. I'm doing a 5-year retrospective on the Millbrook 9 case. Could I ask you a few questions?" Byron smiled, recognizing the surname. "Are you related to Mrs. Chun who ran the grocery store?" "My grandmother," Jessica replied with obvious pride. She always said that story taught her that kindness to strangers can change the world. It inspired me to become a journalist. It was a perfect example of the ripple effects that continued to spread from that single act of a father refusing to give up hope. Mrs. Chun's granddaughter had become an investigative reporter specializing in government accountability. Brooke Sterling had started a nonprofit helping other at-risk youth. Colonel Vance had led comprehensive military justice reforms. Even the Channel 7 reporter who had captured their revelation on live television had gone on to win a Pulitzer Prize for her follow-up investigation into illegal government experimentation programs. "The question everyone asks," Jessica said, pulling out her recorder, "is whether you ever imagined your search for one missing daughter would lead to all this." Biren looked around the foundation building state-of-the-art missing persons database, family support services, legal advocacy program, and research center all housed under one roof. Through the conference room windows he could see Alden Thorne, now a recent law school graduate, leading a training session for new family advocates. Kathleen Chavez was in another room, conducting interviews via video call with families from around the country whose children had vanished under suspicious circumstances. Honestly, Byron replied, I never imagined anything beyond getting Juniper back. But these kids, all 9 of them, they taught me that survival isn't enough. They showed me that when you've been given a second chance, you have a responsibility to create second chances for others. What he didn't mention was how profoundly his definition of family had evolved. Cole Vance, now 21, still lived with him while finishing college. 3 other kids from the original 9 spent so much time at his house that neighbors had stopped asking if they were related. His dining room table, which had once seated just him and his memories, now regularly accommodated 12 people for Sunday dinners that had become legendary in their circle. What about the military revelation that, as you put it in the original story, broke the internet? Jessica S. Byron chuckled. The revelation that the U.S. military had been conducting illegal experimentation that required faking children's deaths had indeed caused a massive internet firestorm. #Millbrook9 had trended worldwide for weeks. The congressional hearings had been watched by millions. The documentary film about their story had won an Academy Award, but more importantly, it had led to comprehensive reforms in government oversight, new protections for whistleblowers, and international treaties governing human experimentation. I think, Byron said carefully, the real revelation wasn't about military cover-ups. It was about the power of truth-telling. 9 kids who refused to stay silent changed everything, not because they were special, but because they were brave. Enough to speak up when it mattered. As if summoned by their conversation, Juniper appeared at his side, having finished her tour. At 18, she had grown into a confident young woman who carried herself with the grace of someone who had faced the worst the world could offer and chosen hope anyway. Dad, she said, slipping her arm through his, the last tour group just finished. Want to help me lock up? Actually, Jessica interjected, could I ask Juniper one final question? Juniper nodded graciously. Media requests had become routine over the years. What would you tell other young people who feel powerless to change things that seem too big to fight? Juniper considered the question seriously, as she always did. I'd tell them that power isn't about size or authority or resources. It's about deciding that something matters more than your fear of speaking up. We were just kids asking questions about science projects. But we kept asking questions, even when it became dangerous, even when the answers led us to terrible places. She gestured toward the memorial garden, where several families were visiting the trees planted for children who had come home. Every person out there started as someone who refused to accept. This is just how things are. Every reunification happened because someone decided that one missing child was worth fighting for. Every reform happened because someone believed that ordinary people deserved extraordinary justice. As they walked through the building, turning off lights and securing doors, Byron reflected on the journey that had brought them here. 5 years ago, he'd been a man consumed by loss, searching desperately for a daughter he refused to believe was dead. That search had led him to 8 other remarkable young people who had needed rescue just as much as Juniper. But in the end, they'd rescued each other. They'd created a family from shared trauma, transformed suffering into service, and proved that love really could triumph over even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. You know what the best part is? Juniper said as they stepped outside into the evening air. What's that? Tomorrow, there's another family that just reported their teenager missing under suspicious circumstances. Another parent who refuses to give up hope. Another chance to prove that families never stop fighting for each other. Byron looked at his daughter, brilliant, compassionate, unbreakable, and felt the same surge of pride and gratitude that had sustained him through their darkest moments and brightest triumphs. Ready to go home? He asked. Always, she replied, But home for both of them had become something much larger than the house where they lived. Home was the chosen family they'd built from impossible circumstances. Home was the community of advocates and allies who had rallied around their cause. Home was the knowledge that their story had inspired others to keep fighting for truth, justice, and the radical belief that every missing child deserves to be found. As they drove through the familiar streets of Millbrook Valley, Byron knew that their story would continue long after the headlines faded and the documentaries were forgotten. It would live on in every family reunited, every truth exposed, every ordinary person who decided to do something extraordinary. Sometimes, the most beautiful stories begin not with happy endings, but with the refusal to accept that there are no happy endings possible. Sometimes miracles happen when we refuse to stop believing in them. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.